Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading from Allbyon to Britannia, Book 1, The Witches of Old Albion by Brandy Pearson. This is going to be part 1 of a story called The Tale of the Forest. It's quite long, so I've decided to split it into 3 bits, not of equal length. So here's part 1, The Tale of the Forest. In the days of old Albion, when witches brewed potions and wizards brewed trouble, at least according to the witches, there was a witch called Jane Morris. She was a wandering witch and, like most of her sisters, had her route that she took every year. She walked from village to village around the edges of the great Oakbourne forest, which lay in the river valley of the Oakbourne River in the southeast of Albion, to the south of the city of the White Tower. One evening she arrived at the village of Ashington, which was large enough to have its own inn. She entered and was greeted by several of the villagers. "Mistress Morris!" cried a voice she recognised. "So pleased to see you. Come here and let us buy you a pot of ale. You can settle an argument for us." "Well, thank you, Farmer Hodge. I hope your knee is better. I've walked all the way from Greenhill and could do with a drink. As for the argument, I'll do my best." She went over and sat with Farmer Hodge and his friends and enjoyed her ale as they told her about the dispute. "It's about worms," said the farmer. "Earthworms or fabulous beasts?" she asked. "Well, that's what the argument is about," he replied. "My friend here says that worms are just creatures of old tales and were never real. I say that they were real, but that they died out many years ago. But Davy here says that he's seen one in the forest just days ago." "You've seen a worm?" said the witch in surprise. "I'm a carpenter by trade. Last Friday I was looking for a good straight tree for planking and went deeper into the forest than I usually go. I heard a creaking and a rustling deeper in, and between the trees I saw the scaly sides of a great worm. I was so terrified I dropped my axe. I bent down to pick it up, and by the time I stood up straight again it had gone." "You're certain it was a worm?" "What I could see was the flank of a beast that was as tall as me. I could hear the scales rubbing along the forest floor. It was a long way off, but I spend a lot of time in the forest and I've never seen such a sight before." "Well, there's a good tale of a wizard who accidentally turned himself into a worm, but that was because of a picture in his book of spells. I've heard people say that there may be some left in the wild corners of Albion, up in the north of Caledonia, and there are tales of dragons in the mountains of the land of the Gales, but I've never met anyone who's seen one. I've never even met someone who had met someone who's seen one, until now it would seem." She did not want to contradict Davy. After all, she had not been in the forest with him, but in all the years she had been travelling around the edges of Oakbourne Forest she had never ever heard of a worm in the forest. However, that was not the end of the matter, for a week later, in the small hamlet of Hale, she met 2 young women who told her they had seen a huge flying beast while gathering mushrooms. They still turned pale when they talked about it. Jane listened carefully as they described the beast, which did not sound to her like a worm or even a dragon, but she did not know much about other monstrous beasts, except that she had not believed there were any in Oakbourne Forest. In the next village she visited, 3 Oak Green, she arrived as a whole family were packing up to leave the area because they had seen giant spiders in the forest while searching for their lost dog. She thought that she probably ought to try to dissuade them from leaving, because surely there could not suddenly be giant spiders where there had never been any before, but she had not seen what they had seen, so how could she contradict them? That night, lying on a truckle bed in the kitchen of one of her friends in the village, she came to the realization that she was out of her depth. She knew a lot about herbs and healing spells, weather and water spells, growing spells and scrying spells, but she knew nothing about monstrous beasts, especially beasts that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. But where could she turn for help? There was an abbey at the other side of the forest, 2 or 3 weeks' walk away. She knew the abbess there very well, but she doubted that she could help. She was a practical person, good at pickling and drying food for winter and the like, but not interested in strange beasts from old tales. Even if there were any wizards within 3 or 4 days' journey, she did not know where they might be, and doubted whether they would take her seriously if she had the chance to tell them what she had heard. It was a week's journey to the city of the White Tower and the Wizard's School and the King. Would there be anyone there who could help? Eventually, she had an idea. The next morning, she drew out of her rucksack an old notebook with soft leather covers. It was her Book of Shadows. Mistress Joanna, who had trained her up, had given it to her many years ago, and in it she had written recipes, knitting patterns, spells, and household tips. Eventually she found a spell she had been taught many years before by a witch down on the coast. It was a dream spell. She would send it out like sowing seeds and hope that the dream message would flower in the dreams of someone who could help. She sent out the spell a few days later, after she had moved on to a large village called Deerstoke. She knew that she would stay there for a week, so if anyone understood her dream message, they would be able to find her. By that time, she had now heard more strange tales from the forest, sightings of the worm, a distant glimpse of an ogre stomping off towards the river, and more giant spiders. One afternoon, when there seemed to be no one who needed her help, she went off for a walk into the forest. She followed an old path that she had been told led to the river, and which she could follow back to the village. The trees grew thickly, so it was not long before the village was out of sight. It was late spring, and the birds were singing, and the sun shone through the bright new leaves, and made dappled patterns on the earth beneath. She loved the forest, the great broad oak trees, the stands of tall beech trees, the dark pine trees on the hillsides, and the stately elms. Forests could be dangerous. There were wolves and wild boar, and even strange people, but the thought of worms and the like seemed wrong. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a brief glimpse of something too fast to name. There was a rustling, and whatever it was had gone. Her heart was racing, and she wondered if she could carry on. A little further, she thought she heard a whispered voice warning her, "Do not go on," but it was so quiet, she was not so sure. She hesitated, but carried on further down the path towards the river, but soon stopped. It was growing darker, the shadows of the trees tinged with something that made her feel uneasy, maybe dark magic. Then far ahead she saw something, a slithering shape, that she realized with horror looked like the flank of a worm, not a story about ancient times or places far away, but deep in the forest. She turned around and quickly returned to Deerstoke. On her last day there, she was singing a healing spell over the broken leg of a lad who had fallen out of a tree. She had set it and put it in splints. The lad had yelled in pain, so there was an element of a sleeping spell in what she was singing to calm him down. The lad's sister appeared in the doorway, clearly hopping up and down in excitement. As she finished her song, the girl blurted out, "There's a man! He wants to see you, Mistress Jane." And we will find out what he wants to see Mistress Jane again about tomorrow in part 2 of The Tale of the Forest. See you there.